Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Sunday program, Jews on Broadway, from Shtetl to Sondheim, with Dr. Stephen Whitfield, Professor Emeritus from Brandeis. I'm Linda Goff, and President of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. So I welcome our members and friends of members and others. We have approximately 175 people who registered this program. So hopefully we will have the vast majority of you this afternoon, and we look forward to a fascinating program. Let me turn it over to my fellow board member, Leona Rubin, who will do the official introduction of Steve Whitfield. Leona, thank you.
Okay, so a few months ago, I was on one of my favorite websites called Hoopla. For those of you who don't know what Hoopla is, it's a website you get from the library, and all you need is a library card. You can get ebooks, videos, audios, movies, and so it's a wonderful thing to have and all free. So on that site, I was intrigued by one that I saw the title being Jews on Broadway, from Shtetl to Sondheim. Sounded really interesting. Professor Stephen Whitfield was presenting this talk to an audience. And so I loved it. So I decided to contact him, and Professor Whitfield agreed to Zoom on to New Mexico and do a presentation for us. And so he's zooming out to the Southwest today. Stephen Whitfield is a professor of American Studies Emeritus at Brandeis University, where he taught for 44 years. He's also served as Fulbright visiting professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and at the Catholic University of Leuven, and as a visiting professor at the Sorbonne and University of Munich. But maybe he's never been in New Mexico, even though he's been all over the world. Your first time, well, welcome. His 9 books include In Search of American Jewish Culture and The Culture of the Cold War. So let's learn about the songs of Broadway and its roots from Tin Pan Alley and on to Hollywood. So here's Professor Whitfield.
Thank you, Leona. Leona, thank you for that introduction, even though you embarrassed me, because I have to admit, I've been to a number of different places, but I've never actually been to New Mexico. So it's a chance to do this virtually. I've been to Arizona, been to Texas, been to California. I regret that I've never been to your state, but I'm very glad that Zoom makes possible the opportunity to be with you, at least virtually, and to have a chance to talk about the role that Jews have played in the formation, in the shaping of American musical taste. That taste, I think it's fair to say, emerged in terms of its influence around the time of the First World War. That taste largely disappeared in terms of the power of its impact by roughly the time of the Vietnam War. So that it's fair to say that this was a music that ran its course for roughly half a century. It was a music that united Americans in all sorts of ways. It was a music that seemed to transcend the differences of geography, differences of ethnicity, even differences of race and of age. A musical form that in all sorts of ways served to unite a very disparate and very divergent society and give it a sense of at least some kind of unification around the sort of music to which Jews were unusually responsible for contributing as creative figures and to some extent as performers as well. So what I'd like to try to do this afternoon is to try to suggest the ways, as Leona mentioned, by which this is a music that started in Tin Pan Alley early in the 20th century, then came beginning in the 1920s to form an American musical theater. And then with the advent of sound to also move to California and to establish, of course, the Hollywood musical as well. And it's a story that, of course, in terms of the contributions that American Jews have made, it's an extraordinary story, a remarkable story. But I'd like to start on a rather poignant note, which is to say, because America proved to be so hospitable, so generous, so inviting to talent in its musical culture, it meant, in other words, that there was always the chance that this was a form, this was a music that would lure some of the most creative and gifted Jews away from the distinctiveness of Jewish culture itself into the broader American society. So that it was that larger society that offered the possibilities for those who were very talented and those who were very lucky. Give them a chance for success, for glory, for fame, for wealth. But it always risked, of course, in doing so, that it would drain away the creative resources and the vibrancy of the distinctiveness, the particularities of Jewish culture itself. And perhaps that story can best be told through the career of a man named Sholem Secunda, who was born in 1894 in Tsarist Russia. He early showed a precocity for music. And had his family not brought him to New York in 1906, it's very likely that Sholem Secunda would have had an important career within the Pale of Settlement in Russia, would have had an important career within within Judaic liturgical music. But he was brought to New York by his parents in 1906. He was billed as the Crown Prince of Chazonim, the Crown Prince of Cantors. And he came to the attention of one of the impresarios of the Yiddish musical theater, Boris Tomaszewski. And Boris Tomaszewski recognized the promise of Sholem Secunda, but thought that because he was foreign born, because he was Russian born, it would be better if he could collaborate with an American-born teenager of talent, whose original family name was Gershowitz. Then it became Gershowitz. Then it became Gershwin, and then it became Gershwin. So Tomaszewski introduced Sholem Secunda to George Gershwin, but Sholem Secunda refused to collaborate with George Gershwin, because Gershwin had no formal musical training. He was utterly unpolished. His talent was raw. And Sholem Secunda didn't see the point of collaborating with such a person. And many years later, after George Gershwin had become internationally famous, he ran into Sholem Secunda in New York and expressed his gratitude to him, because had Sholem Secunda been willing to collaborate with him, Gershwin would have remained within the world of Yiddish musical theater and would never have broken out into the larger society. But it's within those constraints of Jewish culture that Sholem Secunda worked. And it was a respectable, a perfectly solid career. And in 1932, he collaborated with a lyricist named Joe Jacobs in a Yiddish musical of which the English title is "You Could Live If They Let You." One of the songs in that musical in 1932 was "By Mir Bist Du Schön," "To Me You Are Beautiful." And that song was a tremendous hit in that musical, 1932. It became an important hit also for bar mitzvahs and Jewish weddings, played often in the Catskills, but clearly a work that was designed to work only within Jewish culture itself. There were lines in there such as, even if you were a Galicianer, I wouldn't care, it wouldn't matter to me, because the Galicianers were regarded as not only pious, but also superstitious and provincial and narrow, something that non-Jews would not, at least non-Jews would not easily be able to fathom. But the 1932 was a terrible year to produce a musical, a terrible year, not only for musicians, but for virtually everyone else. And in 1935, Jacobs and Secunda decided that they had no alternative except to transfer the copyright, the musical rights, to Bymir Bis-Duchesne, to a Yiddish music publisher. And they sold the rights to Bymir Bis-Duchesne for a grand total of $30 during the pit of the Depression. And of course, the lyricist and the composer had to share those $30, $15 each. What happened next has a number of different versions, a number of different stories, but one version that is picked up occurs in 1937 at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, where a budding songwriter whose name was Sammy Cahn, who would later jumpstart the career in the 1950s of Frank Sinatra, would go to the Apollo Theater just to catch the acts and perhaps get some inspiration. And one night in 1937, he saw a Black singing duo named Johnny and George sing Bymir Bis-Duchesne in Yiddish. And Sammy Cahn was stunned because the audience around him was going wild. They loved that song, so much so that Sammy Cahn thought that this could be a tremendous kind of crossover hit if only the audience could understand the lyrics. And so he went within a week to the president of Decca Records, who liked the idea, asked Sammy Cahn and a collaborator to translate Bymir Bis-Duchesne, the lyrics to it, into English, although keeping the title. And it was recorded in December of 1937 on Decca Records by a Greek-American trio, the Andrews Sisters. And the Andrews Sisters made it an incredible hit, the biggest single hit of 1938. Something like 200,000 copies of the sheet music were sold. About 250,000 of the records, the Decca record version, was sold. Life magazine did a wonderful story about the popularity of Bymir Bis-Duchesne, reporting that Gentiles were going wild for the song, going into record stores and demanding a record called My Mere Bits of Shame, or Buy a Beer, Mr. Shane. Whatever that song was entitled, they loved that song. Ella Fitzgerald did a famous hot version of it at Carnegie Hall later in 1938. Everybody, it seems, was having a wonderful, exalting experience of enjoying Bymir Bis-Duchesne, everybody but Sholem Secunda. Sholem Secunda was to spend much of the rest of his life trying to regain the rights to Bymir Bis-Duchesne. He finally did so in 1961. And before he died, 13 years later, he decided to treat himself to an around the world tour and went to the baths in Tokyo. And he happened to ask the masseuse there if she happened to know any American songs that she could sing to him. And I have a feeling that the members of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society will know the punchline when she said that she knew only one American song. And she proceeded to sing to Sholem Secunda in Japanese, Bymir Bis-Duchesne. So that is the perhaps poignant story of Sholem Secunda and the limits, in other words, of Jewish culture, always being threatened by the possibility for those who were lucky, those who were gifted, of working outside that range. And the story of Jews on Broadway is basically the story for that roughly half century of Jews who were either themselves immigrants who had usually been brought to America at very young age, or themselves the children of immigrants, creating the sort of music that was to sweep so much of America and eventually the world. I should be more accurate in saying it was not just children, but overwhelmingly the sons of immigrants. Almost no women were involved in the creation of this particular music, but it was a music that in all sorts of ways was really crucial in shaping the national taste. And it started, you might say, on Tin Pan Alley, started with music publishers early in the 20th century, grinding out hits, and the term Tin Pan Alley was coined by a journalist named Monroe Rosenfeld, because it's the sounds coming from the pianos in these buildings sounded to him like tin pans being hit against one another. This was a music that was joyous, a music that was cheerful, a music that was optimistic. It was a music that, in a sense, celebrated America, its opportunities, its freedom, its possibilities to be something different. And it was a music, you might say, that demonstrated that these Jewish immigrants, or the sons of Jewish immigrants, loved America perhaps more than they actually knew very much about America. Take, for example, the first big hit that George Gershwin had, which was in 1919. The lyricist was Irving Caesar. George Gershwin's brother Ira would not join him until 1924. And in 1919, Gershwin had his single biggest hit of his career, which was a hit called Swanee. Excuse me, let me go back here. And in so doing, he did it in a way that expressed a certain kind of exaltation for the Swanee River in Florida. And it was so successful that it didn't matter that neither George Gershwin nor Irving Caesar had ever actually seen the Swanee River. And in the 1920s, they decided to visit it, and they were shocked that it was in fact so boring and so unromantic, and it was just a kind of creek. And this was made into a hit by Al Jolson. And it was, of course, one of his biggest hits. Jolson had an early hit 8 years earlier, 1911, with a song called Waitin' for the Robert E. Lee, about a steamboat coming down the Mississippi River. The song was written by L. Wolfe Gilbert, and you may remember the early lines, way down on the levee in old Alabama. L. Wolfe Gilbert had been born in Odessa on the Black Sea. He had only the dimmest view of the geography of the American South. He did not know that there are no levees in old Alabama. You'd have to go 150 miles to the west of Alabama in order to find any levees. Or take, for example, Carolina in the Morning, written by Gus Kahn, in which Gus Kahn, born in Koblenz, raised in Chicago, had never been to the Carolinas when he wrote that enormously successful song of the mid-1920s. My favorite example of the uncertainties of geography actually does not involve the United States, but the province of Saskatchewan. And that is later in Irving Caesar's career, he wrote a song about Saskatchewan, a song in praise of the spectacular grandeur of the mountains of that province, the ways in which the mountains really shaped so much of the landscape of Saskatchewan, without realizing that there are no mountains in that province. It's flat, it's a plateau, which did not stop the legislature of the province of Saskatchewan from designating Irving Caesar's song as the official song of the province of Saskatchewan. So this is something that indicates, in other words, the extraordinary opportunities, even if geographically uncertain, of this particular kind of music. And it's the sort of music that really had an amazing impact upon American life itself. So let's take, for example, something that occurred in 1920, something that people in New Mexico probably don't think too much about, but matters very much to Bostonians. This is the greatest ball player of his time, Babe Ruth, and the owner of the Boston Red Sox needed money in order to invest in a Broadway musical called No No Nanette. And the best way the owner of the Red Sox had to raise money was to sell his best ball player, not only the best ball player on the Red Sox, but the best player of his time in Major League Baseball, Babe Ruth, sold to the New York Yankees so that he could raise money for a musical. And if you go on to basically a half century later, you take, for example, West Side Story. Here is Leonard Bernstein conducting the chorus, Stephen Sondheim at the piano. That musical hit Broadway in 1957. The film adaptation occurred in 1961. And for over a year, the cast album for the film version of West Side Story was the #1 record on the Billboard charts. So from the perspective of 2021, it's rather hard to imagine that any Broadway musical, no matter how impressive, would be the single most popular record of its time. We now no longer have records, but you all get the point. And in 1963, after the assassination of President Kennedy, Mrs. Kennedy gave her first interview to the Boston-based Jewish journalist, Theodore White. And in the course of the interview, in the course of the reminiscences, Mrs. Kennedy recalled that sometimes in the evening in the White House, she and President Kennedy would listen to the cast album of a 1960 Lerner and Loewe musical called Camelot. And when that interview was recorded, when that story was reported in Life magazine, the term Camelot became then, came to be bestowed upon the administration of John F. Kennedy. And again, from the perspective of 2021, try to think of any subsequent presidential administration that ever had its name basically taken from a Broadway musical. And that is one of the ways by which we can think about the extraordinary reach, the extraordinary scope and magnitude of this kind of music. And this was music that was of such distinctiveness in terms of its creators, that is overwhelmingly Jews, that it's very hard to come up with a major composer, songwriter who was not Jewish. Excuse me, let me jump ahead here. Other than Cole Porter. Here, Cole Porter is shown in the middle here. This is Irving Berlin, Richard Rodgers, and I can't see the rest of the screen, but it's Ira and George Gershwin, I'm pretty sure. A caricature by David Levine. Cole Porter was a Yale-educated, educated in Yale from Indiana, an Episcopalian, who in the early 1920s became an expatriate in Paris and entertained at various social events and parties his own compositions. But Cole Porter always wanted to go back to America, wanted to go to New York and to become a success on Broadway. So he returned to New York and he ran into George Gershwin. Shown here with his brother Ira, and asked George Gershwin, what is the secret of success on Broadway? Gershwin looked at Cole Porter and allegedly said, and I quote, "Write Jewish," end of quote. Cole Porter wasn't quite sure what that meant, although he thought it meant something about the sort of melodies in a minor key. It may have meant something about something exotic, something romantic, something maybe even tropical. He also went up to Richard Rodgers and asked him, what is the secret of success on Broadway? And Rodgers told him, and I quote, "Write Middle Eastern," end of quote. And that is what Cole Porter did in songs like Night and Day and Just One of Those Things, My Heart Belongs to Daddy, Begin to Begin, and so on. So successfully that Richard Rodgers later commented that Cole Porter could write Jewish tunes even better than he could. And in the mid-1930s, Cole Porter went to Hollywood to audition some of his latest songs in front of an MGM producer named Sam Katz. And after Cole Porter had played one of those songs, Sam Katz said to Cole Porter, and I quote, "Why, Cole, that's beautiful. That's Jewish," end of quote. So that is, in a sense, what this sort of music was able to achieve. It didn't even necessarily have to be written by Jews, although overwhelmingly it was written by Jews. And it was the music that, in other words, suggested the extraordinary talent and creativity that came ultimately from Jewish neighborhoods and that then would to sweep across the United States. There are all sorts of ways by which we could look at the impact of this music, all sorts of ways by which the composers really had an extraordinary reach. But for the sake of the argument, let's focus on one of them, and that is Irving Berlin. It's hard to talk about Irving Berlin without reaching into superlatives. It helped that he lived to the age of 101. He was writing successful music before Ronald Reagan was born. He was still writing lyrics while Ronald Reagan was in the White House. When the Gershwin family decided to honor its older son, Ira, by bringing into their Brooklyn apartment a piano. This was the symbol of middle-class success. Ira had been able to graduate from high school. George Gershwin did not. But it was not Ira Gershwin who sat down at the piano. It was the younger son, George. His parents did not know that George Gershwin knew how to play music. But George Gershwin sat down at that piano in that Brooklyn apartment. And the first song he played was You've Got Your Mother's Big Blue Eyes by Irving Berlin. Tonight, when the Oscars are held, one of the major contenders will be a movie called Mank, about the making of Citizen Kane, as you all know, about the ways by which Citizen Kane is a satire of, an attack upon the publisher, William Randolph Hearst. William Randolph Hearst fell in love with a chorus girl and singer named Marion Davies. He fell in love with her in 1915 by seeing her on stage in a review. And the song that she was singing is the girl on the magazine cover. That song was written by Irving Berlin. The family of Leonard Bernstein in the Boston suburbs was utterly unmusical. His father was in the beauty shop supply business. He didn't have any interest in promoting his son's career in music, didn't see any point to it. But Leonard Bernstein remembered that the first song he ever heard as a child was a song called A Russian Lullaby by Irving Berlin. In 1926, there was a review on Broadway called Betsy, largely forgotten. But one of those songs was sung by Al Jolson, and that song was called Blue Skies by Irving Berlin. After Al Jolson introduced Blue Skies to the audience went wild to such an extent, was so appreciative of that Irving Berlin song, that they demanded 24 straight encores before they would allow that review to go on. And the next year, as this slide shows, Al Jolson broke the sound barrier with the Warner Brothers, the jazz singer. A musical, first, earlier a play, before that a short story, but the theme being that Al Jolson, or the character played by Al Jolson, has to chant Kol Nidre, because his father, the cantor shown here in the middle, is too ill to be able to conduct the Kol Nidre service. And yet there's a conflict because the Al Jolson character is opening at the Winter Garden that same night as Kol Nidre. That's the basic theme. And the movie itself actually opens up in New York one night before Kol Nidre. And audiences that first night, that is the first night that audiences would be able to hear in a basically silent film, hear the new vitaphone mechanism that allowed them to hear sound. The first song that Al Jolson sings, the first song that audience hears him sing is Irving Berlin's Blue Skies. And of course, then audiences throughout the United States and eventually the world would be hearing that music. So those are one of the ways by which one can get the sense of Irving Berlin's impact, but it goes far beyond that. 1932, he writes the music for a review called Easter Parade. And in that is, of course, that particular song. And the late Philip Roth remarked that what Irving Berlin did to the holiday of Easter, which of course is one of the two most important moments in the Christian calendar with the resurrection of Christ, Philip Roth noted that what Irving Berlin was to remove it from any sort of Christian meaning and Christian implication, and instead make it, Roth said, a holiday about fashion, made it in effect into a fashion show. So if you're thinking, and this may well be one of the questions to be raised in the Q&A period that Linda will be orchestrating, one of the questions that inevitably can be raised is, what is there that is Jewish about such music? And at least a tentative answer that I would give is that a music that basically desacralizes our society and our culture, that removes it from any sort of distinctive denominational force or authority, a music that basically makes it possible for Americans, whatever their faith, whatever their religion, or lack thereof, that they can join in, they can appreciate, they can celebrate this sort of music. 10 years after that, Irving Berlin was involved in writing the music for a movie called Holiday Inn. And he realized that he was one song short. And over the weekend, he wrote a song that he was so proud of that when he came into his office on the following Monday morning, he announced, and now I'm quoting, "I've just written the best song that I've ever written. I've also written the best song that anybody has ever written." End of quote. And that song, of course, is White Christmas. There are maybe 400 different recorded versions of White Christmas, probably more. The Bing Crosby version is, of course, the most famous, but White Christmas has been recorded by everybody from Barbra Streisand to Elvis Presley. Many of you undoubtedly know there's even a Yiddish version done by Mandy Patinkin, which in a sense puts the song back into a kind of original version. At least that's the way Mandy Patinkin would have put it. There are more sheet music has been sold of White Christmas than of any other song. It is undoubtedly the most popular song ever written by an American. And again, if you follow this analysis, if you acknowledge at least this possibility, again, consider what Irving Berlin did to the other most important moment in the Christian calendar, which of course is the birth of Jesus. And again, it is not something which, in that song, it is not something that is in any ways religiously limiting. It does not refer to the birth of Christ. It does not refer to anything that could be described as denominational, does not refer to anything that would exclude others. And to put it back into what Philip Roth was arguing, what Irving Berlin did with that moment on the Christian calendar was to make Christmas into a holiday about snow. And again, this is something that Irving Berlin, who was the son of a part-time cantor, somebody who had no particular appreciation for Judaism. He thought that being Jewish was a penalty, something that was an impediment. But nevertheless, it seems to me that his own Jewish identity, however limited and however shallow, helps explain why he could come up with a song that is not in any way religiously limiting to Christians, but a song that seems to invite a celebration and enjoyment really by everyone. And yet, amazingly enough, Berlin was to do it again. Now we have to go back to 1918, during the course of the First World War, then called the Great War, when he wrote a song called God Bless America. In the often warlike hysteria of the First World War, Berlin realized that the pacific and ironic theme and tone of God Bless America wasn't quite right, wasn't in fact militaristic. And so he put it in his, he put it away. And 2 decades later, with war clouds on the horizon as a result of the Munich conference in September of 1938, he got out the song again. And it was sung by Kate Smith a little bit later in that fall. But the real impact did not begin until the following spring, when it was clear that war was indeed very, very much on the horizon, that the Munich conference had obviously failed to stop the Nazi juggernaut. And it was reintroduced at Ebbets Field in Brooklyn when the Dodgers first played that season in Ebbets Field. And when the singer began singing God Bless America, the fans that afternoon rose from their seats, and the men took off their hats, not caps, but hats. And they thought that they were hearing, in effect, the national anthem. The national anthem had already been decided in 1931 by the US Congress in its wisdom. Until 1931, there had been no national anthem. But in 1931, the Congress designated the Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key. And I can only wonder what would have happened if Congress had delayed until 1939. Almost certainly, God Bless America would have been designated the national anthem. The following year, God Bless America was sung at both the Democratic and Republican national conventions, as though God Bless America reflected the sentiments, the beliefs, the faith that both political parties ascribed to and wanted voters to understand. These are their values. This is what they represent. So that is a way of indicating then the impact of one of these Jewish songwriters, in some ways the most extraordinarily successful and certainly among the most prolific. We still don't know exactly how many songs Irving Berlin wrote, but he certainly wrote maybe 1,200 songs. And he never really stopped. He lived long enough to enjoy the Beatles, lived long enough to hear Willie Nelson sing Blue Skies. And I can only mention in passing that insofar as there is an anthem for show business, of course, he wrote the anthem of show business. There's no business like show business. 1946 in Annie Get Your Gun. Again, an amazing, extraordinary story. Here we get, for the interest of time, we get to, in a sense, one perhaps final argument, and then I'd love to get your own reactions, your own impressions, perhaps your own disagreements, which Linda will be filtering for us. And that is Rodgers and Hammerstein. They too, I believe, reflect this sense. It may be a very limited and a very narrow sense that Irving Berlin also was able to embody. And that is the God that is invoked in God Bless America is not a Christian God, certainly not a Jewish God. It's not a deity that is in any ways reflective of any particular religion, any particular faith, any particular denomination. And Rodgers and Hammerstein were able to do that as well. In 1945, they did a musical called Carousel, set in the very, very Protestant state of Maine. And in that musical, there is a song called You'll Never Walk Alone. Billy Bigelow has already gone to heaven. It sounds very, very much like a hymn. And yet it does not refer to any religion, does not reflect any particular deity. It sounds religious, it sounds pious, and yet it's not Protestant, it is simply inclusive. Their last big hit was 1959, which was The Sound of Music. The Sound of Music has a song in there sung by a Mother Superior in the very, very Catholic country of Austria called Climb Every Mountain. And even though it's sung by a Mother Superior, it does not mention anything about Catholicism. It does not denote anything particular to the Roman Catholic Church, or even more broadly to Christianity, but is again a kind of a kind of religiosity that is in no ways limited, in no ways exclusive. And if there is to be a kind of Jewish note to this particular kind of music, it would really be it's written by secular Jews who somehow want to embrace America by making sure that neither Jews nor anyone else gets left out in the celebration of America. The Sound of Music was made into a movie, 1965. It won the Oscar for Best Picture. And interestingly enough, the National Council of Churches, the umbrella organization, the Federation of Protestant denominations, had a film review board. And that film review board said that the best movie for Protestants to see that year was The Sound of Music. The Catholic film review board also said that the best movie for Roman Catholics in America to see was The Sound of Music. When The Sound of Music played in Salt Lake City, for the first 19 months of its when it was shown on screens in Salt Lake City, 250,000 tickets to The Sound of Music were sold, even though the US Census could only find 190,000 people living in Salt Lake City. So it was also the most popular movie that year for Mormons. And therefore, it's a way of saying then that this was an extraordinary moment, perhaps the last peak moment in terms of the impact of that kind of music. So the story comes to an end, I believe, with Stephen Sondheim. I'm not alone in believing that Stephen Sondheim, as a lyricist and as a composer, is the greatest one of these Broadway figures of all. More talented, more original, more gifted, more creative than anybody that ever has preceded him. And yet it is fair to say that his impact on American musical taste is far, far less than even his greatest predecessors. And the explanation has nothing to do with his gifts, but everything to do with changes in musical taste and changes in the national sensibility. I mentioned that this was a music that began in the era of the First World War and came to an end in the 1960s with the Vietnam War. So a music that's basically celebrated America, a music that honored its ideals, honored its optimism, honored its hopes, were basically blasted in the 1960s, particularly by the divisiveness and the frustration and the disappointments, and if I may say, the tragedy of the Vietnam War. So the kind of upbeat spirit that animated the Broadway musical for half a century simply could not be sustained. And therefore you have the wry, ironic, often extremely bittersweet musicals that Stephen Sondheim has produced. And you might want to say that musical taste changed beginning in the 1950s with the emergence of rock and roll, with a sort of music that was aimed primarily at teenagers, and therefore put audiences into a niche by age, increasingly by race, sometimes by region, as with the emergence of the popularity of country and Western music. And therefore the music that was aimed at adults that everybody could enjoy, that music simply could not sustain itself after roughly half a century. But it is something that has created an extraordinary cultural treasure for everyone to enjoy. And now, Linda, I'm looking at you, and I thank you for your own presidency and your own orchestra of this event. I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Whitfield. I'm sure everyone here today enjoyed your presentation. One of the questions that was asked by more than one of our attendees, you mentioned earlier that early songwriters were told or suggested to, quote, write Jewish. Could you expand upon that a bit and what you interpret that to have meant at the time? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I could give a satisfactory answer. The simplest way, which will look like fudging, is to say that Jewish music at its simplest definition is whatever music Jews write. So at one level, you might want to say, and that's called it a sociological level, you might say that it has extraordinary range. It could mean klezmer music, it could be Bob Dylan, it could be Simon and Garfunkel. At the sociological level, it's whatever Jews write, which allows for the possibility of extraordinary diversity, extraordinary range of possibility, that there's no simple answer. If, however, it's confined to what was understood in terms of the Broadway musical, which, as Leona also earlier mentioned, is also starting in Tin Pan Alley and includes the Hollywood musical, we're talking about something much more specific produced in America. And it is a music that may have some limited roots in Jewish liturgical music. It's a very, very hard thing to say. I'm not in any way a musicologist, but there have been efforts by musicologists to see something out of the liturgical tradition that might somehow find its expression, at least in some songs that these Broadway composers wrote. The evidence here is impressionistic and very limited. It could include George Gershwin describing his most famous song, Summertime, as, quote, cantorial, end of quote. Though again, I'm not sure I'm qualified to know what that means. But E.Y. Harberg, who wrote the lyrics for Over the Rainbow for the Wizard of Oz 1939, E.Y. Harberg, of all of the major Broadway figures, was the only one who had a reasonably full experience in the synagogue. When he heard Summertime for the first time, E.Y. Harberg, Yip Harberg as he was called, said, and I quote, "This is music that I have heard all of my life," end of quote. Some limited efforts to find in some works some echoes, but it's very, very hard to do that. And my own answer would be, limited as it is, it's simply a different kind of music.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. Given the number of Jewish composers, why were there hardly any musicals other than Fiddler on the Roof with an explicit Jewish theme?
Great, great question. Fiddler on the Roof is 1964. And Fiddler on the Roof, as I suspect many of you know, was not expected to succeed. It was not expected to go past, as one of the makers of that musical said, not once the Hadassah theater parties were exhausted, there would be no audience left. And of course, it was to circle the entire globe. So it's mysterious that even Fiddler on the Roof was expected to fail. And the probable answer was that until Fiddler, there was no particular sense that being Jewish, or to put the Jewish experience, I should say the Jewish collective experience, on the Broadway stage would gain enough traction with the broader American audience. This was, of course, but quite apart from its artistry, this is something that was always had a commercial aim. The whole point was, of course, to make money, and that is how one becomes successful. And not probably, in my view, not enough trust was given to the broader American audience that could enjoy, that could appreciate seeing the Jewish experience on stage. So it required a breakthrough. It took to 1964, but I think these were basically commercial considerations. It's a very, very difficult thing to predict what will be successful. The extraordinary success of Oklahoma, for example, Rodgers and Hammerstein, 1943, was also expected to fail. There were empty seats when it opened on Broadway in 1943. One of the great producers of the time, Mike Todd, said of Oklahoma before it opened, "No gals, no gags, no chance." And so it's a very tough business to guess what will be successful and not. And my only answer is nobody would predict how the story of Tevye and his family would be seen as a kind of story that has a kind of universal import.
Okay. A comment by one of our attendees, and perhaps you're already aware of this, Sholem Secunda was musical director at the Concord Hotel for 28 years and conducted Passover services and weekly concerts during the summer. And he continued to do this through about 1961.
Yes, he had to do many, many things to make a living. He also wrote the score for the 1939 Yiddish film Tevye der Milchiger, Tevye the Milkman, perhaps the last great Yiddish film done before the Holocaust. So he did have a perfectly successful, if not notably famous career, but it was always within that particular ambit. But I did not know that about the Concord Hotel.
Oh, okay. An interesting factoid.
Sure, yes. Not just a factoid, a fact.
Well, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Okay. One question, if I understand it correctly, is how should one interpret the music of the Sherman Brothers, Jewish boys writing music and lyrics for Disney? I'm not quite sure what that might be all about.
There were lyricists, composers for Disney. Unfortunately, I'm having a senior moment, but they did in fact write a number of the Disney animated films post Walt Disney himself, I'm pretty sure. Walt Disney died in mid-1960s, but the two that I'm drawing a blank on did that later. The Pocahontas film was done by them, a number of them. I'm just sorry to be blanking on the names. Yeah, Disney, but without going into too many details, Disney was the only major studio that did not have a strong Jewish component in it.
Okay.
That became later, really after his death.
Okay. Here's the question. How many of the composers that just you mentioned today, and perhaps others who were well known, actually received a formal music education?
Another great question. The one who had the most was Jerome Kern. I should say it's a little bit complicated here because some of the composers were of German Jewish background, Jerome Kern being one of them. Of that earlier generation, he most famous certainly for Showboat, including the music for Old Man River. He was trained in Heidelberg. And so he had a strong formal musical career, formal musical background. Richard Rodgers was a graduate of Columbia and also had some. Certainly Leonard Bernstein, it goes without saying, of course, that's another generation. Obviously had an extraordinarily solid music background at Harvard and at the Curtis School of Music in Philadelphia. Stephen Sondheim, although he majored in mathematics at Williams, did study composition at Princeton with a really, really sophisticated avant-garde composer, Milton Babbitt. But they, I would say, are probably the exceptions. The others were, to a degree, self-trained or had music in the background sufficiently. Harold Arlen, who wrote the music for Beyond the Over the Rainbow and a number of important blues compositions. He was the son of a cantor. But I would say it's more typically not anything formal. Irving Berlin was notorious in that he could not read or write music and not even play the piano without transposed keys. That's the extreme case.
Yeah. Okay. One more question here. What do you think of the musical Falsetto about a Jewish family?
Yeah, I think there are actually two. There's Falsettos and a sequel. I've never actually seen it. This program is not really about my own musical taste, but an effort to get at the history of this phenomenon. But it's an example, if I may say so. I've only heard the score a few times. It allows for the possibility that even though I believe the centrality of the Broadway musical cannot be really extended and repeated, the Broadway musical itself has a number of variations and extensions, falsettos being one of them. There are other ways by which the musical lives, but I also hasten to add that the great exception here is, of course, Hamilton. And Hamilton is the great violation of every generalization that one might make. He was assigned the task, Lin-Manuel Miranda was assigned the task of writing what the Sharks would be singing and saying, to put that into Spanish for a revival of West Side Story on Broadway. So he met Stephen Sondheim, and Sondheim, after they had a conversation, Sondheim asked Lin-Manuel what he was working on. And when he told Sondheim, I actually am writing a musical about the founder of the nation's financial system, Sondheim, instead of saying that's the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard of, he said, go for it, go to it. And the rest is history.
I'll just read you one more comment. Let's see, bear with me a moment, if you will. That among Richard Sherman's music, it's a small world for Disneyland, and wrote music for the film and Mary Poppins.
Okay, I did not know that. Okay. Did not know that. I appreciate that.
Okay. Well, those are the questions. People have made comments to everyone in the group, and thank you very much for that. And Dr. Whitfield, it's been a real pleasure and privilege to have you join us this afternoon. And you must come to the land of enchantment. You can't fly over us next time.
Love to do it. Thank you. And I can answer questions on email if anybody has any further comments.
Okay, we are recording the chat box, so if something should come up, we'll be happy to pass them along. But again, on behalf of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon, and to Leona bringing Dr. Whitfield to our attention for a terrific program.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, stay safe, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, yes. Bye-bye, thank you.